and damaging, which can never be justified and which have never been justified, however casually their advocates might think so. All of us can and should know better, for however can enforceable obligations to pay for our consumption as we consume of it, how can that damage us? When unexploited promissory obligations are no more than obligations to pay and to retire principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. It is by our very right to engage in promissory obligations, which alone can sustain our regular example of a newlywed couple purchasing a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan for $1,000 per year, or $83.33 per month. Deny them their right to engage in legitimate, enforceable promissory obligations, and we not only deny them their right to own a home they can afford to pay for as they consume of it across their entire lives, we likewise subject them to exploitation, forcing them instead to save from a circulation not even intended to represent a home which does not even exist yet, and depriving them of the home until perhaps the ends of their lives. Impostors even unknowingly borrow from my own 1975 parable of perfect economy as the authoritative testament that money cannot be debt, that it must be spent or even purportedly gifted into circulation. In shameless ignorance, they borrow from my own words, spoken from the fictional mouth of Benjamin Franklin, to tell me and to tell us every day that money must be a gift. In that 1975 parable, the words of Mike Montagne, issued through the fictional mouth of Benjamin Franklin, demonstrated how to fund government without conventional taxation, to dramatically illustrate a point that, on the contrary, there is one and one only just and soluble life cycle of money, in which our production is monetized always instead according to obligations to pay and to retire principal from circulation. Economy is not a free lunch, nor can it be a free lunch if there is to be monetary justice. In even more extreme cases of irreverence, others merely assert that money can only rightly represent resources. Yet mathematically perfected economy is the only process of monetization which readily represents the further, vital, and even indispensable issue of our contribution to production, which in fact is generally itself the very thing we seek reward for, even in the fundamental harvesting of resources. Mathematically perfected economy, therefore, itself even represents the very reward or cost we seek in return for producing resources. Still others assert that money must be based on energy. They just say so, without ever even establishing how energy could even possibly relate in volume and flux to the production or the productive efforts which we generally intend to tokenize as our prospective reward for our like contribution to overall prosperity, that we may receive due reward for our contribution to the pool of wealth. Others merely say, too, that we must return to precious metal monetary standards, that this will just somehow resolve the disparities which plague us. But the disparities which plague us are not consequences of facts our tokens of other value are no longer comprised of gold. Any possible precious metal monetary standard itself, on the contrary, by its very relatively finite volume, can only deny us representation of differing volumes of other wealth. Therefore, that differing volume can only deny us just reward for our accomplishments or contribution to a pool of wealth, from which at least we deserve to receive duly. Without even a possibility of consistent volumetric representation, how is it even possible for a precious metal monetary standard to avoid itself inflicting perpetual instability and injustice? Despite even the historical fact, precious metal monetary standards have never engendered stability or just trade. Advocates with vested interest just tell us so, again and again and again and again. Today even, in answer to the arguments of mathematically perfected economy, they even claim that the disparate volume of precious metal monetary standards just somehow doesn't even matter. How could that possibly be so? What credible person even arbitrarily decides what does or does not matter, when the very mattering they disclaim disproves all that they merely claim? However, is mere pseudoscience or rejection of science or accountability somehow to account for the issues before us? How credible would such an idea be in any genuine discipline? A 1970s essay, "Interest is Usury," is now imitated and even particularly compromised in many, many, many thousands of web pages. The original essay mathematically proves that any rate of interest which requires borrowing interest back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation is not only inherently terminal, but of course then too, that any plausible or effective rate of interest inherently produces what are inevitably usurious sums of debt. Because, of course, no more usurious sum of debt can possibly exist even than a sum of debt which engenders inevitably terminal dispossession, not only of all we have produced, but even of our indispensable means of production. When I wrote this essay, and for dozens of years afterward, the inexclusive thinking was the very contrary. People refused even to examine the intrinsic volumes which are ascertained by this proposition, preferring instead just to presume somehow that some reasonable and just volume of flow could return principal and interest back into circulation. Just somehow, without perpetually increasing a sum of falsified indebtedness in proportion to a circulation, until we suffered terminal sums of debt, which even destroy the creditworthiness to borrow further, as remains necessary nonetheless, even to maintain a vital circulation. No. Instead, the vast sums of obfuscated money we perpetually pay out of the circulation just somehow return otherwise, without perpetually and irreversibly increasing the sum of falsified debt, which clearly exists in such an escalation everywhere around us. Not only now, but even in the first days, those who refused to think the issue through denied the only veritable explanation for all the things we have suffered all this while. No one could ever really understand this fact that any plausible application of interest is inherently usurious, and thus that there isn't even any legitimate way to purportedly distinguish between any plausible rate of interest and usury, without too understanding or conceiving its equivalent expression, which is the veritable thesis we have so often repeated already, that any purported economy subject to interest inevitably collapses under terminal sums of insoluble debt. For the very fact the present obfuscation of our currency inherently multiplies falsified debt in proportion to any vital circulation is itself the very proof of a fact there is no such thing as purported interest as distinct from usury. Even recently, even just a handful of years ago, prominent imitators pretending authority which couldn't even be original argued interest wasn't even the issue. Some prominent imitators even yet worked only for reductions of interest rates, never having done the math, still not having done the math, and never having even realized the still ever obvious fact so well explained that even the least rate of interest which must be borrowed back into circulation ultimately engenders terminal dispossession and failure. These pretenders even sought to preserve interest, hoping preposterously for a compromised rate of interest which would please the purported bankers into allowing us, of all misconceptions of propriety, to ostensibly enjoy a tempered rate of terminal dispossession. But who ever justified interest in the first place?